The antiseptic smell of the hospital corridor stung my nostrils as I made my way to the intensive care unit. After 40 years as a military nurse, I'd grown accustomed to that clinical scent, but I never thought I'd encounter it while searching for my own son. My name is Margaret Maggie Sullivan, and at 65 I had just completed my final tour as a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. 4 decades of service, from Vietnam to Desert Storm, from earthquakes in Haiti to refugee crises in Sudan. 40 years of sending money home so my son Nathan could have everything I couldn't give him in person. 4 decades sacrificing my presence for his financial security, trusting that my daughter-in-law Vanessa would care for him as she had promised. But now, as I stood frozen in the doorway watching my only child lying motionless among a tangle of tubes and machines, I realized my terrible mistake. I had arrived home that morning, after completing my final mission at a field hospital near the Syrian border. My dress uniform was still perfectly pressed in my old military duffel bag, alongside my medals and the plaque commemorating my years of service. I had planned to surprise Nathan, maybe cook his favorite pot roast, and start making up for lost time. Instead, I found an abandoned house, mail piled up at the door, and a chilling silence that made my combat-trained instincts scream that something was very wrong. It was Betty, the neighbor who had lived across the street since Nathan was a boy, who broke the devastating news. "Maggie, honey, Nathan's at Memorial Hospital. Been there nearly 2 weeks now. And that wife of his, I saw her Instagram posts. She's on some cruise ship with her friends in the Caribbean." When I found my son in that sterile hospital room, his body was barely recognizable, gaunt, pale, with tubes emerging from him like some macabre extension of his being. Stage 4 lymphoma, the doctor told me. If they'd caught it earlier, he might have had a fighting chance, but now it was just a matter of time. "Mom," he whispered when his eyes fluttered open and recognized me. "You came back." "I'm here, baby," I replied, clutching his cold hand between mine. "I'm not going anywhere." His eyes, so much like his father's, brightened momentarily before closing again. "Vanessa." Shh. He couldn't finish. The heart monitor emitted a long, piercing beep that cut through me like shrapnel. Doctors rushed in, attempted resuscitation, but I knew my Nathan, my only child, had died in my arms just as I'd returned home to be with him. The rage that filled me as I scrolled through the notifications on Nathan's phone was unlike anything I'd experienced in war zones. Messages from Vanessa explaining why she couldn't visit the hospital because she had an important engagement. Photos of her on a luxury cruise, champagne flute in hand, laughing carefree while my son died alone. And worse, bank transfers and credit card statements showing how she'd spent the money I faithfully sent each month, supposedly for Nathan's treatment on designer clothes, jewelry, and lavish parties. Something inside me, something I'd kept tightly controlled throughout my military career, broke loose like a hurricane. The woman who had promised to love and care for my son had betrayed him in the worst way imaginable. She had used his illness as an excuse to exploit him, leaving him to die alone while enjoying the money I sent for his medications. She hadn't even had the decency to be by his side in his final moments. I made my decision right there. Vanessa would pay for every tear my son shed in solitude, for every moment of pain he endured without the support he deserved. Not through violence or blind vengeance, but through justice, the same justice I'd fought to uphold throughout my military career. I knew exactly where to start and who could help me navigate the legal and financial system. My friend Richard, a retired JAG officer, answered on the first ring when I called from the hospital corridor. "I need to freeze all my daughter-in-law's bank accounts immediately," I said without preamble, "and prepare documents to initiate legal proceedings against her for negligence and misappropriation of funds." "Maggie, what's happened?" Richard asked, alarmed by my tone. "Nathan is dead," I replied, the words like glass shards in my throat. "And his wife was partying while it happened." That night, I returned to Nathan's empty house. Among my son's belongings, I found a journal, where he had meticulously recorded each expense for his treatment, every medication he needed, and every excuse Vanessa gave him for why she couldn't purchase them. I also found folders of unpaid medical bills, while the credit card statements showed purchases at luxury stores on identical dates. The evidence mounted with each passing minute. With trembling hands but firm resolve, I organized all the documents. My military training had taught me to be methodical, even in the darkest moments. And this was undoubtedly the darkest moment of my life. The phone rang just after midnight. It was Vanessa. "What the hell have you done?" she screamed without even greeting me. "None of my cards are working. The ATMs are rejecting me." "Your husband is dead," I responded with a calmness I didn't know I could maintain. "While you were partying on that cruise ship, Nathan was dying alone in a hospital bed." There was a momentary silence before she completely changed her tone. "Maggie, you don't understand. I was under so much stress. I needed a break. Taking care of someone with terminal cancer is exhausting. Save your excuses." I cut her off. "I have proof of every dollar you diverted, every treatment you didn't buy, every lie you told while he trusted you. I'll see you in court." I hung up without waiting for a response. I sat in the rocking chair on the porch, the same one where I used to rock Nathan to sleep as a baby, and let the tears flow freely for the first time since receiving the news. I didn't know how I would continue living without my son, but I had a clear mission: to get justice for him and find some way for his life, so unjustly cut short, to continue having meaning. Richard worked with surprising efficiency. In less than 24 hours, all accounts linked to Vanessa were frozen. The power of attorney Nathan had granted me before I left for my last deployment proved providential. It allowed me to take complete control of his financial affairs. The bank confirmed that the credit cards had been canceled and that any attempt to access the funds would be rejected. But my battle was just beginning. Vanessa wouldn't give up easily, and I needed to ensure that justice was served, not just for Nathan, but for everyone who had been deceived by her false facade of devoted wife. That night, as I looked through old photographs of Nathan, I wondered what my life would have been like if I had been more present. If I had resigned from the army to be with him, perhaps I would have noticed the symptoms of his illness earlier. Perhaps I would have seen the signs of Vanessa's betrayal. Perhaps my son would still be alive. But remorse wouldn't bring Nathan back. All I could do now was honor his memory and make sure Vanessa faced the consequences of her actions. With that resolution in mind, I fell asleep in Nathan's armchair, clutching his favorite flannel shirt as if it were the only thing keeping me connected to this world. At dawn, the doorbell woke me. It was Richard, with a briefcase full of legal documents and a determined expression. "We have a preliminary hearing tomorrow," he announced, entering without waiting for an invitation. "The judge has agreed to review the case on an emergency basis given the circumstances." I offered him coffee, and while preparing it, he explained the process. We would present all the evidence: the bank statements, the unpaid medical bills, the text messages, the social media posts, showing Vanessa squandering money while Nathan suffered, all to prove not just misappropriation but criminal negligence that might have contributed to worsening my son's condition. "Do you think we have a chance?" I asked, serving the coffee in chipped mugs I found in the nearly empty cupboard. "We have more than that," Richard replied with conviction. "We have a solid case, Maggie. Vanessa hasn't just taken advantage of your son. Her negligence could be considered an aggravating factor in his death. She won't escape this." His words gave me a kind of cold comfort. They wouldn't bring Nathan back to life, but at least his death wouldn't go unpunished. However, as Richard continued explaining legal strategies, part of me wondered if this was enough. Would it be sufficient for Vanessa to lose access to the money and face possible legal charges? Would that be justice for a man who died alone, betrayed by the person who had promised to love him in sickness and in health? That afternoon, after Richard left, I decided to visit the hospital one more time. I needed to talk to the doctors and nurses who had cared for Nathan, gather more information for our case, but I also needed to better understand how his last days had been, what he had suffered while I was away, fulfilling my final service. Dr. Thompson, a middle-aged man with kind but tired eyes, received me in his office. He showed me Nathan's complete medical file, the tests that showed the relentless progression of the lymphoma, the treatment recommendations that were never carried out, the multiple occasions when he had tried to contact Vanessa without success. Your son could have lived perhaps another year or two with proper treatment, he explained in a soft but firm voice. The disease was advanced, yes, but there were options that could have improved his quality of life and extended his time. I tried to explain this to his wife, but she rarely came to consultations, and when she did, she seemed distant, uninterested. Each word was like a stab wound. I clenched my fists in my lap, containing the rage that threatened to consume me. Did my son know? Did he know he had so little time left? I managed to ask. Dr. Thompson nodded slowly. I believe he suspected, though he tried to stay optimistic. He kept asking when you would return from your deployment. He wanted to see you one last time. The tears I had been holding back flowed uncontrollably. Nathan had died waiting for me, wishing to see me one last time, while his wife abandoned him for a life of luxury and frivolity. There's something else you should know, continued the doctor, extending an additional folder. Your son donated bone marrow a few months ago. When he was still strong enough, he wanted to help other lymphoma patients, especially children. He said if he couldn't save himself, he at least wanted to save others. My heart swelled with painful pride. Even facing his own mortality, Nathan had thought of others. He had always been that kind of person, generous, selfless, brave. Do you know if his donation helped anyone? I asked. As a matter of fact, yes, the doctor replied, with the first hint of a smile since our conversation began. A 10-year-old boy, Tommy. He's responding well to treatment. Although he still has a long way to go, he's an orphan, lives in the State Children's Hospital for Kids Without Families. Something ignited within me upon hearing about this boy, Tommy, who carried a part of my son in his veins. It was as if, somehow Nathan was still alive through him. Could I meet him? I asked impulsively. The doctor seemed surprised but nodded. I'd have to make some arrangements, but I don't see why not. I think it would do Tommy good to meet the mother of the man who gave him a second chance. I left the hospital with such an intense mix of emotions that I could barely breathe. The pain was still there, crushing and omnipresent. But now there was something else. A spark of purpose. A small light in the absolute darkness that had been my life since finding Nathan in that hospital bed. As I walked to the bus stop, my phone rang. It was Vanessa again. Maggie, please, we need to talk. This has gone too far. Nathan and I had an arrangement for you to let him die alone while you spent his money? I replied, anger boiling inside me again. You don't understand, she insisted, her voice now pleading. Nathan knew I needed my space, that I couldn't be locked up in a hospital all day. He understood that Save your lies for the judge, I interrupted. Tomorrow you'll have your chance to explain why you thought buying jewelry was more important than medication for your dying husband. I hung up before she could respond. I had no interest in her excuses, in her desperate attempts to justify the unjustifiable. Tomorrow would be the day she finally faced the consequences of her actions. That night, in the empty house that had once been my son's home, I made a decision. If we won the case against Vanessa, I would use the money to create a foundation in Nathan's name, an organization dedicated to helping lymphoma patients who couldn't afford treatments, especially children without families like Tommy. It would be a way for my son's generosity to continue, for his life to have meaning beyond his premature death. With that purpose in mind, I prepared for the legal battle awaiting me the next day. I took out my old dress uniform. With the medals and decorations earned over decades of service, I ironed it carefully, making sure every detail was perfect. Tomorrow, I wouldn't present myself just as Nathan's mother, but as Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Sullivan, a woman who had dedicated her life to protecting others, and who would now fight one last battle for her son's justice. The courthouse was more crowded than I expected when we arrived the next morning. Richard explained that several cases had been rescheduled, but ours would be attended to promptly due to the special circumstances. I sat in the front row, upright and with a steady gaze, my military uniform perfectly ironed over my shoulders like armor. Vanessa arrived a few minutes later, dressed as if she were going to a photo shoot instead of a judicial hearing. A tight black dress that probably cost more than 3 months of my pension, glittering jewelry, and impeccable makeup that tried unsuccessfully to hide the traces of stress on her face. She was accompanied by an expensive-looking lawyer, with a tailored suit and a leather briefcase that seemed worth more than all the furniture in Nathan's house. When our gazes met, I saw a flash of fear in her eyes. For the first time, I think Vanessa understood she was facing something bigger than an angry mother-in-law. She was facing justice. Judge Henderson, an older man with a reputation for severity but fairness, entered the courtroom. Everyone stood, and after the initial formalities, the hearing began. Richard presented our case with military precision. The evidence of financial misappropriation, the medical testimonies, the social media posts that demonstrated Vanessa's abandonment, all perfectly documented and organized. The judge listened attentively, occasionally asking questions, but maintaining an impassive expression. Then it was Vanessa's lawyer's turn, who tried to paint a completely different picture. According to him, my daughter-in-law had been a devoted wife who simply needed moments of respite from the stress of caring for a terminally ill patient. He argued that the money spent on luxuries was legitimately hers as Nathan's wife, and that there was no concrete evidence that the lack of treatment had accelerated my son's death. When I was finally granted the opportunity to speak, I rose slowly, feeling the weight of each of my medals as a reminder of my duty. Your Honor, I began, looking directly at the judge. For 40 years I served my country as a military nurse. I've seen life and death on the front lines. I've held the hands of soldiers as they took their last breath. And I've worked tirelessly to save those I could. All that time I sent money home to ensure my son Nathan had the best, especially when he fell ill. I paused, gathering strength to continue. I trusted Vanessa. I entrusted her with the most precious thing I had in this world. And she betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. Not only did she misuse the money intended for Nathan's treatments, but she abandoned him when he needed her most. My son died alone, Your Honor, while the woman who swore to love him was partying on a cruise ship with her friends. My voice broke, but I forced myself to continue. I'm not seeking revenge, I'm seeking justice. And I'm seeking to ensure that my son's suffering isn't in vain. If this court rules in our favor, I will create a foundation in Nathan's name to help other lymphoma patients, especially children without families, because that's what my son would have wanted. The silence that followed my words was absolute. I saw that even the judge, known for his impassivity, seemed moved. Vanessa looked at the floor, unable to hold my gaze or that of anyone else in the room. After a recess of 1 hour, the judge returned with his decision. This court finds sufficient evidence to order the permanent freezing of all assets of the deceased Nathan Sullivan, as well as to revoke any rights of Mrs. Vanessa Sullivan over said assets, in view of the clear evidence of misappropriation and negligence. Complete administration of the estate is transferred to Mrs. Margaret Sullivan, mother of the deceased. The bang of the gavel sealed the decision. I felt a wave of relief mixed with a pain I knew would never completely disappear. Vanessa rose abruptly, her eyes now full of fury. You can't do this to me, she shouted, addressing me instead of the judge. It was my money too. I had the right to live my life. The court officers approached, but their intervention wasn't necessary. I stood up, confronting her one last time. You had the right to live your life, Vanessa, but not at the expense of Nathan's. Now if you'll excuse me, I have a foundation to create. I turned and left the courtroom with my head held high, leaving behind the indignant shouts of my daughter-in-law. Outside, the sun shone with an almost offensive intensity, as if the world had forgotten that my son was no longer in it. But I wouldn't forget, and I would make sure no one else did either. Richard caught up with me on the courthouse steps. Congratulations, Maggie. It's a complete victory. I nodded, but the victory felt empty without Nathan. What are the next steps? We need to legalize the foundation, establish the statutes, determine how the funds will be distributed. But first, he paused, looking at me with concern. You need to rest, Maggie. You've been through a lot. I'll rest when the Nathan Sullivan Foundation is up and running, I replied, knowing it was the only way I could move forward. Now, there's a boy at the state hospital I need to meet. The State Children's Hospital was on the other side of the city, an old but well-maintained building that strived to offer a welcoming environment despite its limited resources. After identifying myself at reception, I was led to the pediatric oncology ward, where Dr. Thompson was already waiting for me. Thank you for coming, Mrs. Sullivan, he greeted me. Tommy is excited to meet you, although he's still weak from the treatment. He led me to a small but bright room, decorated with children's drawings and superhero posters. On the bed, a small, fragile boy was playing with an old toy car. His hair, sparse due to chemotherapy, framed a pale face with the most expressive eyes I had ever seen. Tommy, this is Mrs. Sullivan, the mother of the man who donated his bone marrow to you, the doctor introduced me. The boy looked up, a mixture of curiosity and shyness in his eyes. Are you the superhero's mom? He asked in a barely audible voice. Something inside me broke and mended in that instant. I approached his bed and sat in the chair beside him. Yes, Tommy. Nathan was my son. And yes, I think he was a kind of superhero. He saved my life, he said simply. The nurse says his marrow is in my bones now. Does that mean we're like family? The question took me by surprise, but I answered without hesitation. Yes, Tommy. I think that makes us family. A smile lit up his face. And for a moment I saw in him a reflection of Nathan as a child. The same determination, the same inner light, despite the circumstances. Can I show you my drawings? He asked, pointing to a folder next to his bed. I'd love to see them, I replied, feeling a warmth I thought I would never experience again. We spent the next hour talking. Tommy showed me his drawings, told me about his dreams of becoming an astronaut, or maybe a doctor, to help kids like me. He told me about his life in the orphanage before getting sick, how he missed his friends but not the strict rules. And he asked me about Nathan, listening attentively to each anecdote I shared about his childhood, his likes, his dreams. When Dr. Thompson returned to indicate that Tommy needed to rest, I was surprised to realize how much time had passed. The boy seemed as disappointed as I was that our conversation had to end. Will you come back to visit me? He asked, his eyes pleading. Of course I will, I promised, gently squeezing his small hand. I'll come back tomorrow. As I left the hospital, an idea began to form in my mind. An idea that at first seemed crazy, but with each step I took toward the bus stop became clearer and more convincing. Over the next few weeks, I divided my time between setting up the Nathan Sullivan Foundation and visiting Tommy. The foundation was taking shape faster than I expected, thanks to Richard's efficiency and the generosity of several of my former Army colleagues, who volunteered or donated additional funds upon learning my story. Tommy, meanwhile, was responding well to treatment. His energy increased day by day, and with it, our connection. I brought him books about space, scale models of rockets, and we spent hours talking about the stars and planets he dreamed of visiting someday. One day, while reading him a story before his nap, Tommy asked the question that had been on my mind. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, for he insisted on calling me by my full name, despite my attempts to get him to use a nickname. When I get out of the hospital, will I have to go back to the orphanage? I put the book aside and looked him in the eyes. Would you like to go somewhere else? He nodded, his eyes fixed on his hands that were nervously playing with the sheet. I'd like to live with you, but I know grown-ups can't just take kids home. I smiled, taking his small hands in mine. Actually, Tommy, there are ways that adults can take children home. It's called adoption. And I've been thinking, if you wanted, of course, I could try to adopt you. His eyes widened, a mixture of hope and fear in them. Really? Could you be my grandma? I would love to be your grandma, Tommy. The smile that lit up his face in that moment was worth every moment of pain I had endured since Nathan's death. It was as if a ray of sunshine had broken through the storm I had been living in. But, he continued, his expression becoming serious, aren't you sad about your son? Won't I remind you of him all the time? His question, so mature for a child his age, moved me deeply. I will always be sad about Nathan, I answered honestly. But you are not a replacement for him, Tommy. You are yourself, a special person whom I have come to love. And I believe Nathan would be happy to know we're together. After all, a part of him lives in you. Tommy nodded, processing my words with a seriousness that reminded me again of Nathan. I'd like you to be my grandma, he said finally. Then I'll do everything possible to make that happen, I promised. The adoption process wasn't simple. As a single 65-year-old woman, I faced additional scrutiny from social services. My military record and recent retirement played in my favor, but there were also concerns about my age and ability to raise a child, especially one with special medical needs. But I was determined. I prepared Nathan's old room for Tommy, painting the walls space blue and decorating it with fluorescent stars that would glow in the dark. I bought books, educational toys, and everything I thought he might need or want. Meanwhile, the Nathan Sullivan Foundation began to help its first patients. We established a financial assistance program for lymphoma treatments, with priority for children without family resources. We also initiated a collaboration with the state hospital to improve the pediatric oncology unit, providing new equipment and hiring additional staff. Each day that passed, I felt I was honoring Nathan's memory in the way he would have wanted. And each day, my bond with Tommy grew stronger. 3 months after initiating the adoption process, I received the call I had been waiting for. The social worker, a kind-voiced woman who had visited my home multiple times, informed me that my application had been approved. I could bring Tommy home as soon as he received medical clearance. When I gave him the news, Tommy jumped for joy in his hospital bed, his face lit up by a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire room. Really? I'm going to live with you? He asked, as if afraid it was just a dream. Really, I confirmed, hugging him carefully to not hurt his still fragile body. We're going to be a family, Tommy. The day he finally received medical clearance, I wore my dress uniform. I wanted it to be a special moment, significant. Tommy looked at me in amazement when I entered his room dressed like that. You look like a superhero too, he exclaimed, his eyes shining. Today is an important day, I explained, helping him put on the new clothes I had brought him. Blue pants, a shirt with stars and planets, and sneakers he had admired in a magazine. The day we officially begin our life together. Dr. Thompson came to say goodbye, along with the nurses who had cared for Tommy for months. They all seemed genuinely happy to see the boy leave, not because they wanted to get rid of him, but because they knew he was going to a home full of love. Take good care of your grandma, the doctor told him, ruffling his hair that was beginning to grow back. I will, Tommy promised seriously, taking my hand as if to protect me. We left the hospital, under a surprisingly blue sky. Tommy paused for a moment at the entrance, looking at the outside world as if seeing it for the first time. Ready to go home? I asked him. Ready, Grandma? He replied, squeezing my hand. The taxi took us through the city, with Tommy glued to the window, pointing out buildings, parks, and people, as if everything were a wonder worth mentioning. His amazement at the simplest things reminded me how much time he had spent locked up in hospitals and orphanages, and I promised myself I would make up for every lost moment. When we arrived at the house, Tommy stared at it wide-eyed. Is all this ours? He asked, incredulous. All this is ours, I confirmed, opening the front door. I guided him through the house, showing him each room, until we reached the one I had specially prepared for him. When I opened the door, Tommy was speechless. The dark blue walls were covered with stars and planets that would glow in the dark. There was a new bed with sheets showing the solar system, bookshelves filled with books on astronomy and science fiction, a telescope by the window, and a desk with art supplies and a small microscope. "Do you like it?" I asked, somewhat nervous about his silence. In response, Tommy ran to me and hugged me with all his strength, burying his face in my uniform. I felt the wetness of his tears through the fabric. "It's the best place in the world," he murmured against my chest. That night, I prepared Tommy's favorite dinner according to what he had told me. Spaghetti and meatballs, just like in that animated movie he loved so much. We ate together at the dining table that had been empty for so long, and for the first time since Nathan's death, the house seemed alive again. We established a routine. Every morning we had breakfast together before Tommy went to his new school, where he was adapting surprisingly well despite the time he had spent without formal education. In the afternoons we worked on the Nathan Sullivan Foundation from home, with Tommy helping to organize events and writing letters to other children receiving treatment. On weekends, we explored the city or took trips to the countryside. I taught Tommy how to identify medicinal plants, a skill I had acquired during my missions in remote areas. He taught me to play video games on the console I had bought him, laughing uncontrollably at my clumsiness with the controls. Every night, before sleep, we talked about Nathan. I told him stories from when he was a child, showed him photographs, explained how his generosity had saved Tommy's life. I never wanted my adopted grandson to feel he was replacing my son, but to understand that he was part of a continuation, a legacy of love and hope. 6 months after Tommy came to live with me, the Nathan Sullivan Foundation had grown beyond our initial expectations. We had helped dozens of patients, improved facilities at 3 different hospitals, and established an emotional support program for families affected by lymphoma. That afternoon, while Tommy and I were planting flowers in the backyard, the doorbell rang. It was unusual for us to receive visitors without prior notice. "I'll go see who it is," I said, removing my gardening gloves. When I opened the door, I froze. It was Vanessa. She had changed significantly since the last time I saw her in court. Her clothes were simple, without the luxuries she was accustomed to. Her face seemed thinner, with pronounced dark circles under her eyes, and her posture had lost the arrogance that always characterized her. "Maggie," she said in a low voice, "can I talk to you?" My first instinct was to close the door, to deny her any opportunity to disturb the peace Tommy and I had built, but something in her expression, a vulnerability I had never seen before, made me hesitate. "Tommy is in the garden," I replied finally. "I don't want him to see you. We can talk here, on the porch." She nodded, and we sat on the steps. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything. "I've been in rehabilitation," she finally began, "for my addiction to shopping, to attention, to the luxury life. The court ordered it as part of my sentence for fraud." I didn't respond, waiting for her to continue. "What I did to Nathan, what I did to both of you." Her voice broke. "There's no excuse, I know. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying to change, and that I'm sorry. I really am." I looked at her hands, which were now nervously twisting a cheap handkerchief. I didn't see rings or the designer watch she used to wear. "Why are you here, Vanessa?" I asked directly. "I wanted to return this to you," she said, taking a small package from her purse. "It was Nathan's. I found it when I was packing my things to move. I think he would have wanted you to have it." I took the package with trembling hands and unwrapped it. It was my father's old pocket watch, the same one I had given to Nathan when he turned 18. "I thought it was lost forever. I also wanted to tell you that I admire what you've done with the foundation," Vanessa continued. "I've followed its progress in the news. Nathan would be proud." The words hung between us, loaded with all that could have been and wasn't. I didn't feel forgiveness in my heart, not yet, perhaps never, but I did feel that some of the poison that had been eating away at my soul was beginning to dilute. "Thank you for bringing the watch," I finally said. "It means a lot to me." Vanessa nodded, standing up. "I won't bother you anymore. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and that I'm glad you found a way to move forward. As I watched her walk away, I felt a strange mix of emotions. The pain was still there, of course, but also a kind of closure, as if a dark chapter could finally conclude. Who was that, Grandma? Tommy asked when I returned to the garden. I looked at the watch in my hand, feeling its familiar and comforting weight. Someone from the past, I replied. Someone who returned something important that belonged to your Uncle Nathan. Tommy looked at the watch curiously. It's beautiful. Can I see it? I handed it to him, watching as he examined it carefully, his small fingers tracing the engravings on the silver cover. This watch belonged to my father, then to Nathan, and now it's yours, I told him. His eyes widened. Really? For me? For you. To remind you that there's always time to do the right thing, to help others, to love. That night, as I tucked Tommy into his bed under the fluorescent stars, I realized that for the first time since I lost Nathan, the future didn't feel like an empty and desolate place. I had purpose, I had love, I had Tommy. Grandma, murmured Tommy, half asleep. Today I helped plant flowers for people I don't even know. Do you think that would make Uncle Nathan happy? I stroked his hair, feeling a peace I thought was lost forever. Yes, my boy. I think that would make him very happy. 1 year after Tommy came into my life, the Nathan Sullivan Foundation celebrated its first anniversary with a gala at the state hospital. Doctors, nurses, patients, and donors gathered to commemorate all we had achieved. More than 100 patients helped. A new wing in the hospital dedicated exclusively to children with lymphoma, and a research program that was already showing promising results. Tommy, dressed in a small suit that made him look surprisingly adult, was by my side at the podium when I gave my speech. A year ago, I lost my son Nathan, I began, looking at the audience. It was the darkest moment of my life, a pain I thought would consume me completely. But in the midst of that darkness, I found two lights that guided me back to life: the Nathan Sullivan Foundation, and this extraordinary boy by my side. I put my hand on Tommy's shoulder, who looked at me with a mixture of pride and tenderness that filled my heart. Death can take away those we love, but it cannot take away love itself, I continued. That love continues to live, transforming, finding new ways to express itself, sometimes through a foundation that helps others, sometimes through a child who teaches us to see the world with new and wondering eyes. I looked at Tommy, who smiled at the audience with a confidence that grew day by day. Nathan saved Tommy's life with his donation, and Tommy saved mine simply by being who he is. That is the power of giving, of continuing the legacy of those we've lost, of finding meaning even in our darkest moments. When the ceremony ended, Tommy and I walked through the hospital corridors, visiting the children who hadn't been able to attend the gala. We brought them small gifts, books and toys, but most of all, we brought them hope embodied in Tommy, living proof that the disease could be conquered, that there was life beyond the hospital. On the way home, Tommy fell asleep in the back seat of the taxi. I watched him, his face serene under the intermittent light of the street lamps, and thought about how much my life had changed in just 1 year. The pain for Nathan would never completely disappear. There were days when the memory of his absence hit me with renewed force, moments when I looked at Tommy and wondered what it would have been like to see my own son grow up. But those moments no longer paralyzed me as before. I had learned that the human heart has an amazing capacity to expand, to accommodate both pain and joy, both loss and renewed love. And I had learned that sometimes the best way to honor those we've lost is to live fully, love generously, and continue the work they left unfinished. When we arrived home, I carried Tommy to his room, tucked him under his starry sky, and kissed his forehead. "Good night, my little astronaut," I whispered. "Dream of the stars." In my own room, I took the old pocket watch from my bedside table. I opened it, watching how the hands kept moving forward, marking the time of a life that continued despite everything. On the inside cover, I had 3 names engraved: my father's, Nathan's, and now Tommy's. a line of love that extended through time and beyond death. I lay down, listening to Tommy's soft snoring across the hall and the comforting tick-tock of the old watch. Outside, the city slept under the same starry sky that decorated my grandson's room, and for the first time in a long time, I felt I was exactly where I needed to be. The pain would still be there, always. But so would love, hope, and the possibility of building something beautiful from the ashes of loss. That was the last lesson Nathan had taught me, through his absence, and through the child who now slept peacefully under my care. I closed my eyes, letting sleep take me, knowing that tomorrow would be another day to honor my son's memory, to love my grandson, and to continue the work that had given new purpose to my life. In my dreams, I saw Nathan smiling, his eyes bright and full of the same light I now saw in Tommy. And in that dream, I knew with certainty that he had never really gone. He continued to live, not just in the foundation that bore his name or in Tommy's cells, but in every act of love and generosity his life had inspired. And that, in the end, was enough.